Okay, Assalamu alaikum everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to day 14 of Surah Baqarah. I have to say, I don't know why, but I'm really nervous today. And so I'm just going to say it out there, so hopefully that will make me less nervous. But part of it is because well, first of all, you know, I'm so grateful that the end of Surah Baqarah coincided with this holiday weekend. And obviously we don't want to be celebrating Thanksgiving per se, as we understand, you know, all of the colonial influences and all of that. But I'm grateful for the holiday because it allowed our extended family members to come join us in person. And I think for us, this is a celebration of the end of Surah Baqarah. And it's such a special occasion, and I guess I'm nervous because I hope that we can do it justice, and I wish I'd had more time to prepare something maybe more, you know, I don't know, interesting or whatever. But, you know, just to say that it's incredible that we started this journey on Surah Baqarah on October the 6th, and now is November the 24th. So it's been quite a long engagement, and you know, like when I think back, like I've taken now 3 notebooks or 2.5 notebooks worth of notes just on Surah Baqarah. Like I started a brand new notebook just to, you know, with the new surah. And, you know, so trying to even prepare for like an introduction to, you know, 13 days worth of Surah Baqarah is impossible. And I, you know, like started thinking, okay, maybe I can shortcut it by looking at what I wrote in the last session when you went through the summary. And then I went, oh God, no, then maybe I can go to the beginning and see where we were. And I think that that's what's so fascinating is when we go back and I look at where we were at the start of Surah Baqarah. If you recall, we had just finished all of the Meccan surahs, 67 Meccan surahs. And Sheikh pointed out that, you know, this was so fascinating that, you know, we were at the same place that the early Muslims were when they were embarking on their hijrah, and they had completed everything that God had sent, you know, they had taken everything that God wanted to tell them before the hijrah. And now there was a certain expectation of, you know, their development and their understanding. And, you know, now they're on to the next adventure, as were we. And it's like, are we ready? And are we prepared? And are we worthy of receiving, you know, what would be then the first surah in Medina? And so I think back to, you know, October 6th and how I felt. I was so excited, but also just, you know, a little nervous. And now looking back on the, you know, the 13 halaqah sessions over 2 months, it's like, oh my gosh, what a transformation, right? What a journey we've been on with just this one surah, and what we've learned and what we've uncovered in Bible study, and, you know, walking through, like, first the history, and Sheikh putting us in the context to understand, like, what was going on at the time, what was in the heads of, you know, the early Muslims, what were they experiencing, what were their emotions like, you know, what were their anxieties and trepidations about leaving everything that they had, and going to this new place where they would be vulnerable, and, you know, God knows what challenges awaited them. And then to go through the history, and then to go back and cover it again, then detailing everything that this incredible surah had to teach us about so many different things, which, you know, for me, like, completely babe in the woods about what Surah Baqarah had. I mean, I think at the start of the journey, I really just knew that this is the longest surah, and just, you know, some of the most obvious things that people had heard about, you know, what's in it. But purely, you know, impressionistic, and then now to actually have walked through and then understood the laws and the morality, points of morality that came with it, and just the overall message, and how, you know, God was, you know, acknowledging just the intimacy of creating, of his creation, right? God created us and knows what we're feeling, and knows what our tendencies are. And as we embark on this new journey, what we need to know, and, you know, you're hearing it from how the early Muslims are receiving it, but we, of course, are trying to understand all of that in our time, in our context. And just, for me personally, how powerful it was for me to understand this message at that level and feel like, oh my God, God is speaking to us in our time. I totally see what God is saying. I see what, what we need to do. I see, there's just so many game changers, right, in this surah, in terms of, whether it's calling out the Jews and saying, sorry, you're not the chosen people by ethnicity, but that everyone can be a chosen person based on their actions, or, the rights of women, or, no compulsion in religion, and understanding that in the 9th century, that was radical. Like, how many times did Sheikh through this journey say this was radical for that time, and paint the picture for us so we really understood and felt like, okay, when you say no compulsion in religion, for us now, we think, yeah, of course, no compulsion, it's your choice, whatever you want. But at that time, it was like, no, kings own their people, husbands own their wives, parents own their children. So it was really radical to come in and say, no, you can't force, your child or your wife to believe. And so many of these game-changing kinds of things. So it's impossible to go back and, summarize. And I think that this engagement with Surah Baqarah is something that can literally be studied for a whole lifetime. And just going back to my notes from the very first halaqah, I feel like, oh my God, I'm looking forward to the time, when we get through all of this, to be able to go back and then really do it justice and really try to learn it, so that it's not just kind of a blur of 13 halaqah sessions, but to actually say, okay, this is what Surah Baqarah says about this. And I mean, every single moment, I know at the end of every single halaqah on Surah Baqarah, all of us were like, oh my God, that was incredible. Oh my God, that was incredible. I can't, it's not going to get any better than that. And then sure enough, it would get better. And so to have every session like that is really amazing. And I guess it's also very hopeful. On the one hand, you feel like, that things are so bad for Muslims around the world, and, it's easy to get despondent about, how is it going to change? All the people in power who have all the money and are, controlling the holy sites and controlling the Muslim world, they seem to have everything locked down. So what does that mean for people like us who, want something more beautiful and different and want to find meaning and be empowered by this message? Well, I think that everything we've learned in Surah Baqarah provides that hope and that anchor. And I think for me personally, I feel like, okay, our job is just to let people know that this exists and that this is the way forward, and that this message is just about empowerment and liberation and intellect and heart and soul and everything that is intuitive to you, everything that God wanted from you from the beginning, and in the spirit of love and in the spirit of God wanting to have a relationship with us and having us be the best versions of ourselves, whether we are scholars or doctors or students or homemakers. It just doesn't matter. Like, this message is here for you just to be beautiful and amazing and honor everything that God wanted for us. So there's so much here. So I'm really excited for now an opportunity to have some of the interaction. Like we thank you to everyone who sent in questions. We're going to start with the Project Illumine folks here first, and then we'll work into some of the other interactive questions. And thanks to Rami, because Rami, we got a whole slew of questions, and Rami worked, collected everything and put it, cleaned it up, and just served it up so I could be here and share it with all of you. This is one of my favorite things to do, and sorry, I just went back to the Abdul Halim Quran, which, oftentimes it's like fun to just see, like, how did they summarize, or how did he summarize the surah, and where are we relative to what we've experienced now. So this is the summary. The Cow, a Medinan surah and the longest surah in the Quran, containing material revealed over several years and named after the story of the cow which the Israelites were ordered to slaughter in verse 67. It opens with a response to the plea for guidance in Surah 1, dividing people into three groups: the believers, the disbelievers, and the hypocrites, and closes confirming the tenets of the faith given in the opening verses. The addressee shifts as the surah progresses. At various times, the text addresses people in general, and who are urged to serve God, the children of Israel who are reminded of God's special favors to them and urged to believe in the scripture that confirms their own, and the unbelievers, and the believers who are given instruction in many areas. That's it. So, it's hard, of course. You can't, if you wrote like an adequate summary, you would need many, many more pages. And so it is true that God speaks to all of these people. So, which in summation is God spoke to humanity in these pages, and tried to, tell the children of Israel to believe in what was sent before. But alhamdulillah, I think that all of us have received so much more. And inshallah, over time, as we go back and review and dig in, we'll continue to benefit from this. So I want to actually just start with my own question, which I hope you guys don't mind. I'm just going to jump into the front of the line. So executive privilege, yeah, no, that's not good. But I'm hoping that we sort of, I guess, take for granted. We show up here and we're so excited and we're like ready to receive. And, like Sheikh spends, he's obviously spent an entire lifetime studying this, and, the amount that he prepares and is engaged with this before he arrives here and makes it look so easy, right? It's just like, oh, let me just walk you through this. And by the way, I'll tell you, I'll give you this opinion and that opinion and whatever. It's just like a conductor with a symphony, and we just enjoy the music. But I wanted to just start with a question about, for Sheikh. So it's kind of a personal, now you've obviously lived and breathed this for so long now. But for Surah Baqarah, would you mind situating for us, where was Surah Baqarah in your journey, with the Quran? Where did it fall sort of in, in this equation? You've talked about before how, most people when they start learning the Quran, they don't start with Baqarah, they start, with the short surahs. And I'm curious if you could just tell us where it fell in the journey, and what were some of your biggest queries about Surah Baqarah? What was it that drove your discovery when you were okay, now I'm ready to start thinking about Surah Baqarah?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. First I'm gonna say this just in case it's not obvious to people. When Grace and I never coordinate. Not what I'm going to talk about and what she's going to talk about. And when she asks questions or says whatever she says, it says it as her own autonomous human being. As do I. So if so the question is because although we're married, but we're both extremely busy, and we come together in the halaqah probably more than we come together during the day.
This is when we talk.
Yeah. So she wouldn't, and she doesn't know, she knows she knows when I'm ordering books, definitely, because she pays for them. But that's pretty much it. I mean, I don't, she knows if I write something and I ask her to read it,
This is when I get to ask him questions. Early on in our marriage, I got a question quota because I used to ask him questions all the time, and I usually hit that quota. And now it's like, okay, I'll just wait till the halakha.
I did. That is true. I did give her a quota on questions she can ask me because it was just too much, and.
No executive privilege, no wife privilege.
and often actually quote on how many times she can invade the den. Yeah, I'm not a very nice husband. I guess now I think about it, I'm not a good husband at all.
Not true.
But anyway, okay. So the reason she's asking about Surah Baqarah is that she really wouldn't know anything about. Well, obviously, I mean, first when you know you're memorizing the Quran, it's like most Muslims. Surah Baqarah was among the first surah. I mean, first you start out, of course, with a short surah when you're very young, but then when you're memorizing the Quran, you memorize it in order of the way it's organized, right? Not in order of revelation. And in my case, memorization, what I would memorize visually, meaning that I would actually visualize the page. So, which meant that I didn't concentrate on the meaning at all. And like most Muslims, Surah Al-Baqarah was somewhat of an enigma. It is talking to the Israelites, which is something quite remote from us, addressing historical events that in Qur'anic discourse looks like it is referencing things that it doesn't explain. So it's already referencing things you have no context for. So as the Quran often does, it seems like it's an ongoing conversation. And then the Quran interjects in this ongoing conversation, but if you don't know the ongoing conversation, you have no... And then it has... it addresses a range of laws, and then it has interjections like Ayat al-Kursi, the very closing of Surah Al-Baqarah, and the way you approach it, although even is that you think of it as blocks, like in this segment it's doing this, and this segment is doing that. But part of the hardest thing about memorizing is that there is no one emphasizes a coherence of themes for you to help you memorize. So it is, and no one really tells you why is it al-munafiqun here, or kafirun here, or fasiqun here. The terminology that the Quran often uses, and you just it. And I actually remember when I've asked sometimes, and I'm told, well, it is the reason it's kafirun here is because fasiqun was used in the previous ayah, which basically means it's not an answer at all. It's like, well, it sounds like it's haphazard. Anyway, so that was it for many years. But of course, when I started on this journey, I was approaching the Quran in order of revelation to try to understand it, in relation to the historical dynamics that the Quran addressed. And knowing that Surah Al-Baqarah was the first major revelation after Hijrah, you already have a very complicated dynamic. You already have a very complicated history that you must situate the surah in. And unlike a shorter surah from the Meccan period, it is not sufficient that you read the tafsir and that you do dhikr and that you pray on the matter and that you it is simply not sufficient, because with a surah like Surah Baqarah, like a number of surah from the Medina period, a lot of them, you absolutely have to go beyond the tafsir literature to understand the nuance of the historical dynamics and to try to understand what the actual, because it is one of the things I noticed about Surah Al-Baqarah right away is that it is consistently says yas'alunak, they ask you. So it is in as in legal dynamics, it is a claim and response. So there is actually, if they ask you, then there must be a reason for they ask you. People don't, God is not going to say they ask you and they're not asking. And if they ask, then there must be a reason that they're asking. And there must be a reason that God chose to respond, because it is not conceivable that God responded to every question. And was it just haphazard question, and meaning like the Sahaba, they were just sitting around and someone thought of a question, or was it an actual social dynamic that resulted in what the Quran sums up as they ask you? So, I mean, the Surah Al-Baqarah it is one of the surah that you engage in an enormous amount of research, and research not just in Islamic sources, but research in any historical sources that can shed light on that very beginning Medinian period. And then the evolving realization, because it is an evolution, that of what, remember that the assumption in when that had become by then, when I reached Surah Al-Baqarah, had become firmly anchored. The assumption is that there is a thematic unity to every surah, and that every surah has a reason for being a surah, for being broken, being designated as a chapter, and having a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the question, of course, is, so it is like anytime a reader wants to get into the mind of the author, it is always a challenge, right? Because if the author is human, we could take the language and say the intention of the author is irrelevant. So it's just what the language says on its face, and that's it. But that doesn't work with a divine author. That might work with text that is not divine, because the language itself could render the author irrelevant. I could say, well, all that matters is the language, and I don't care about the intentionality of the author. But with the Quran, you can't do that. You can't say, I don't care what the intention of the author, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then if you say you care, then you must be exceedingly conscious of the arrogance in assuming that you can understand or even inquire into the intention of the divine. And that's an extremely humbling consciousness. So you are treading, what that means is, before I say, this is what God intended, I better do my homework to the umpteenth degree, because it better be a claim that Allah, who sees and knows all, knows that I've done my absolute best in vetting that intentionality from everything that is humanly possible. If it means studying languages, so be it. If it means, spending 6 months trying to get a manuscript, so be it. If it means what you're very familiar with, staying up all night, day after day after day after day, so be it. But it is that, because once you come to accepting that it is not sufficient, that the literal language, we just can rely on the terminology and say that the intention of the author is irrelevant, and then you realize that the obligation of approaching that intentionality, and the intentionality is rendered rather nonsensical unless you really try to the best of your ability, obviously, to visualize the historical dynamics and the actual conversation taking place. Because there are so many references in the Medinian Quran that it's clear that the recipients knew what the Quran was addressing, or had a context that, but for the readers centuries later, without scholarship, it's missing. You just have no frame for it. You're even things that, what is the significance of saying write your debts or witness your debts? Why was that so important? Why did it deserve a Quranic legislation? Why did God deem it worth talking about? If you can visualize many other social issues that existed in society at the time, why did God choose to speak as to some issues but not other issues? These are, so it's an analytical process, and I underscore this, it is not pure analysis unaccompanied by piety. Because without these two components, it doesn't work. It's flawed and it's corrupt. You must humbly, in every step, beg God for guidance. And at the same time, never assume that you've received that guidance. Both, constantly. You just never assume that you've received it, but constantly beg for it. And you must do your homework. The most troubling thing that I find about, it's either the traditional way, where other than the Asbab al-Nuzul reports, there's no contextuality in the traditional context. It's either hadith or nothing. Or once you get Qur'anic studies outside the traditional methodology, then there's a complete absence of Muslim normative commitments. In modern Qur'anic studies, it is like the illegitimate offspring of biblical studies. It literally grew out of the discourses of biblical studies, but illegitimately so, because there is no actual Quranic specific theoretical foundations for the literary criticism around the Quran. It is all an act of imitating Western scholars. And it is often just literally, transplanting methodology without much thought, without... and add to that outside the traditional sphere, Quranic studies is distinctly non-pietistic. Meaning, even if you're Muslim and you're doing Quranic literary studies, as long as you're not within the traditional realm, you go out of your way to pretend to be not a believer and to take the Quran as a human document, as a human product. But the traditional method is deeply unfulfilling for someone who uses their intellect, and who is anchored in modern systems of knowledge, not living in the 12th century, and their brain has not developed since the 12th century. And the system of modern Quranic literary studies is extremely unsatisfying, if not sometimes quite offensive. And so that's where you end up. So it was Surah Al-Baqarah, we covered it in 14 weeks. I think I was researching, losing sleep, buying books, reading books. I would never tell you why I'm buying the books, for what project. I just, I would just say these are the books I need. That's why we're bankrupt, alhamdulillah. But yeah, it was, a good year.
Do you remember what year it was?
Why do you want to know? Well,
No, I'm just wondering what I was doing at the time.
it was...
It's relevant.
What?
I think it's relevant.
It was Surah Al-Baqarah. I mean, it's in my diaries. You'll find it in my diaries. But I think it was after the brain tumor, so it was around 2009.
Okay.
Around 2009. I think it was 2009.
So just as an aside for people who, for people who know us, they know we have this huge library, and it's like this represents our savings and everything like that. And part of the journey of like being married to a scholar too is getting used to the book buying habit. And the one thing that people should know is, like, on the one hand, when you're sitting down and you're paying the bills, you're like, oh God, how are we going to do this? God help us. But then when, it's, and you see, like, your husband searching on Amazon, you're like, oh my God, God help us, please let it be okay. And on the one hand, you're like, oh, okay, here we go. But I have to say two things. One is that God would always help us pay our bills. Some way, shape, or form, like that check from somewhere you didn't expect would just arrive just in time. And this has happened so much now that it's like there's no coincidence, obviously, as we've learned. But when you're actually living through that, you're like anxious, and then getting upset, and then it's like, oh, here's the check. Okay, what's the point? That was number one. So I learned, after several times, there's no point in getting anxious. And then number two is, if you actually, when I would ask him, like, I'd see him searching for stuff, or he would find a book, and then I would be like, oh, what's that about? And then he would start telling me, and then I would become like, oh my God, you have to get that. So part of what was exciting is to know, like, to discover all the different things.
The moral of this story is for students who find themselves in the same predicament, to the wives of these students, don't divorce them. That's the moral of the story. Just don't divorce them.
And just there's this whole world of knowledge that you just never know about, and it's actually so exciting to see. But this is, I think, thank you for that answer, because I think that one of the game changers of this approach I'm always thinking about like what are we doing here that hopefully will make a difference for the future trajectory of Islam and for Muslims, right? And so we know how unsatisfying just the traditional or just the modern approach is. And I think by having now gone through even just Surah Baqarah alone, you've really demonstrated the power of this methodology and underscored the absolute necessity of, the intellect and the piety. I mean, you said in one of the sessions, you cannot be recognized as a true Islamic scholar or Qur'anic scholar unless you have both. It can't be just an intellectual engagement, but you have to have piety. And I think that that's a really bold statement that I don't think I've ever heard anywhere, and that I think most people would not necessarily admit to. But I believe that now, having demonstrated it and said that...
Well, in the current academia, it's suicide. I mean, in the current... The way that... and I often feel really bad for students, because I know that if they're beginning their career, and if they don't want to end up teaching in one of the ghetto Muslim institutions, because Muslim institutions are ghettos. They're nothing more than ghettos, and we just, the sooner we admit that and confront it, and the ostentatious affectations of trying to get affiliated to a university, that university, because I've been in these meetings and I know how academics talk about Muslim institutions behind their back, whether affiliated with Georgetown and they're in some Gulf country, or affiliated with Berkeley, or affiliated with I don't know what. Academic institutions respect you when you have thorough vetting processes, serious peer review, and publications, and your publications speak for themselves. But if you don't want to get stuck in the Muslim ghetto institutions, and you want to compete in the secular academic world, when it comes to especially Qur'anic studies, if you say I'm a believer, your chances of getting hired, go way down. And that makes it very, very difficult. An Ismail Farouqi or a Fazl al-Rahman, or, and even, they're unusual. And with the rise of Islamophobia, there was a period where discourses on pluralism made academic institutions rather shy about discriminating against Muslims. But with the rise of Islamophobia, I've noticed that academics have become far more emboldened about openly excluding insiders to the tradition who speak from normative commitments, loyal to the tradition. And this is, we fought in my own school. You know this very well. We fought a very, very vicious battle to keep Islamic studies open, because there were all types of parties that wanted to close Islamic studies under the guise that it was a place that preaches Islam, not teaches Islam. And eventually that battle was won by keeping Islamic studies open. And I was the chair of Islamic studies for, 10 years or whatever. But once I was gone, Islamic studies is still open, but the same thing about teaching versus preaching has come back. And, I I just often my heart goes out to Muslim students who want to cut a path in the academic world, and at the same time do not want to put on the pretenses of saying, I don't really belong to this tradition. And
I mean, it's an ongoing battle because you still confront a lot of these same issues today, even at the law school to an extent.
I mean, I'm nearing the end of my career, and so
But I think people should know, like, when you started this journey, I mean, there were very few, if any, Muslims in just as law students in law schools, and you were really pioneering in terms of being probably the first professor in a law school teaching Islamic law, because at that time it was so unusual and so difficult, and literally, I mean, being there, he had to actually meet with every single person on the law school faculty as part of a jihad to really teach people why should Islamic law have a seat in a law school, right? But my point being that in even Surah Baqarah, demonstrating this methodology, I can't imagine approaching the Quran in any other way, without the requisite intellect and piety. And I feel like having now displayed the vast difference in quality of understanding, our book, that this is a standard that we as Muslims now can point to and insist upon. And for young scholars who want to see an example of, an academic, a scholar who lived his entire academic career being very open about his commitment to his faith, it can be done and should be done. I mean, it's something that we obviously as Muslims need, as it exists in other faith traditions. It just obviously, in the Jewish tradition, the Hindus, Chinese, Buddhists, you've talked about scholars in those fields. They're all from within the tradition, but obviously in Islamic studies, that's not always the case. But anyway, methodology is such a huge thing. I want to start by asking Joe. I know you had a question about methodology, right? You had sent me a question about Jewish, the sources. Sorry to,
Okay.
I'm going to pull you up and have us start on the Q&A. But did you want to say anything else? Because that was extremely valuable. Thank you.
no, I don't want to because if I unload on that, then
We'll have another day of Q&A.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is not a bad thing. Sorry, Joe. You had a great question. I wanted to start off with you.
Thank you so much. He was going to say thank you for one halakah, but thank you for the 13. So, question is, and it follows on what you were saying about what is the standard, what is required for Baqarah. Is a deep knowledge of the Jewish and Christian traditions, scriptural, historical, linguistic, an essential prerequisite, not just beneficial, not essential prerequisite to fully understand Baqarah. But can you actually understand really what's happening in Baqarah without it? And if not, would that not kind of disqualify most Mufassirun in history? But then, now that I've got the mic, I'm going to ask another one. Closely related to this, I was thinking this throughout several of the halaqas. Is what Baqarah is doing, is this not the earliest example we have of comparative religion? Because it's not just polemics.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, and we often associate comparative religion with later Islamic history, Biruni, and those kind of people, but it seems to be pretty explicit.
Mm-hmm.
Hearing that.
Do you want to just paraphrase?
Yeah, I mean, the first question is about is it imperative to understand the biblical tradition, basically, to understand Baqarah, because of the constant, and notice that it is the Quran itself that is consistently referring to incidents and events that that is part of the history of the Israelites, and what is fascinating is that when you study the same events in the biblical tradition, the the differences are as illuminating as anything. It is actually the differences that often struck me as the most fascinating. Now, there are a couple of things that if you are doing, I take the every historical period has its challenges. We must understand that this, because this is a critical point. Every historical period has its challenges. There are historical periods where an impressionistic, perhaps, tafsir of the Quran, basically the alfaz of Quran, the what the words mean, could suffice, because if you are living in a historical period in which there are many educational institutions that can do the job, then not every scholar that approaches the Quran. But we are living in a historical period where alienation from not just the Quran, but from the language of the Quran. So there's an alienation from Arabic as a language. I was reading something, interestingly enough, it was something about the recent Dune movie. And it struck me that the author was talking about whether Arabic will be a language 100 years from now, and the author of that article was very sure that Arabic is going to be a dead language 100 years from now, that it's one of the dying languages. And if you know enough about the Arab world, you also know that there is a serious problem vis-a-vis the language of the Quran, Arabic as a language, the language of the Quran itself, vis-a-vis Islamic sources, vis-a-vis being sufficiently sufficient ثقافة or a sufficient intellectual knowledge of everything related to the Islamic past. Everything has become reduced to these broad sweeping generalizations. So this historical period, as I've said in the past several times, the jihad of this historical period is a jihad of knowledge. We Muslims are in such dire straits that what is required of a scholar today is far more demanding than what was required of a scholar writing in the 4th century. But so having said that, what often has struck me is that the best commentaries on the Quran, the commentaries by people like Shanqiti or people like Zamakhshari or Razi or Qurtubi, their biblical literacy is actually surprises me. It is clear that they've read the Bible, and it is clear that they know enough to be able to reference the Bible. And that is something that if you read the modern tafsir, is completely absent. So if you are going to say that I really commit myself to a scholarship of the Quran, it is imperative that your intellect, because brain is like a muscle in the body that that needs if it's exercised, it's strong. If it's not exercised, it's weak. Your brain has to be exposed to far more than just the Islamic tradition. Your brain has to be exposed to languages. Your brain has to be exposed to non-Islamic sources. Your brain has to be nuanced in the difference between an Islamic source written in the 1st century Hijrah and an Islamic source written in the 4th century Hijrah and an Islamic source written in the 12th century Hijrah. So the challenge is that what is demanded of us is very serious, the type of serious commitment to knowledge that could uplift a people from being a broken and defeated people to people actually making a contribution to anything. And that does require a very serious investment in knowledge. I mean, what are we investing in? All people in the world, they rise and fall. This is the nature of civilizations. And then people decide to invest in things. So what are we investing in as Muslims? Investing in learning the sciences, math, chemistry, and so on. Well, whatever investments we're doing in this, in the Muslim world, we are not making original contributions. So we're just investing to imitate. Okay. So what are we investing in? Building of nice mosques and people who can, put Islamic texts on computers. I mean, it's really a puzzling thing, is that the amount of investment in the processes of knowledge is woefully inadequate. How many Muslim scholars of Sharia or Quran can comfortably read 5 languages? Why is it needed? Because someone who has been exposed to human thought across several human experiences, their brain works very differently than someone that only knows a myopic human experience and can't transcend it. The way they think of, and this is God's speech, for God's sake. This is the creator of all the languages and all the people and all the histories and everything. So when I approach this author, my attitude should be, I want to learn as much about your creation as I can humanly, and I should feel really bad about the fact that I am not a genius and I can learn, 20 languages and 10 more different cultures and 10 more different histories, because I take very seriously the fact that this is God, the creator of everything, and everything means everything. And so I dip into as much of it as I can. So this is a long-winded way of saying, I know I've been saying this all my, as long as I can remember. And I know that the tendency is to hear someone like me and to say, to just say, he just likes to complicate things and so on. But as long as this remains our attitude, we will never emerge as shuhada an-nas, as witnesses upon him. It's just, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us everything is according to what you invest in, and it's not that. So, but you're absolutely right that this is, in terms of comparative. I mean, how often does the Quran talk to non-Muslims? By definition, this places you in a comparative frame. Because either the Quran is talking to non-Muslims but not really, not seriously. So it really doesn't have anything to say to non-Muslims. But if you take it seriously, then, absolutely, if I'm talking to, at least in a serious context, someone, to Christian, and I'm saying something about what the Quran says about Jesus. And often the attitude, and by the way, this is among the things that drove me in Surah Baqarah, is that, whatever you say about, especially, this is my experience, well, no, actually my experience was both Christians and Jews, is that you don't really understand our tradition. You don't really understand the Trinity. You don't really, whatever claims the Quran is making about what Christians believe, that's not accurate. Well, how am I going to even engage you in anything? You're telling me that the Quran is wrong, both about Jews and Christians and everything. That's not, so how am I going to engage you unless I actually know something? And not just something, but study your tradition so well that I even know more about Jewish theology than the vast majority of Jewish scholars, and know more about Christian theology than the vast majority of Christian scholars. And I can engage in conversations with you which puts the other person, make them realize that they can't speak down to me, this racial colonial element. They can no longer speak down to me as a Muslim, that they have to deal with me as a peer. That I am going to talk to you about the ins and outs of different theologies of the Trinity, in a way that's going to force you to take me as an equal. That's the only way that comparative anything can progress. As long as, my experience, and this is another thing that, drove this journey, is that my experience whenever I would be invited to anything involving comparative anything with Islam, that as a Muslim, I was always spoken down to. I was never at par, even with someone like Maimonides, who, it is mind-numbing for people to speak to me as if what Maimonides brought to the table is just something that I, as a Muslim, can never relate to. It is mind-boggling. But that is an experience I've had so many times. And I would go, and it got so frustrating that you go back to the drawing table and say, okay, what's needed? Latin? Fine. Hebrew? Fine. Aramaic, Syriac? Fine. Reading this theologian, reading this school of thought, reading... But it takes a lot of transparency. I mean, it takes... you have to admit to yourself that, yes, they're being nice to you, yes, they're inviting you, but not because they respect you. I mean, this is the hardest thing to admit to yourself, like in academia. Because, you get an invitation, you go, everyone is being nice to you, they're treating you with, with respect and everything. But to admit to yourself that what you're saying about Islam is there just as a gap filler, but no one is engaging Islamic anything seriously, because no one thinks that Islam has to contribute anything intellectually rigorous or serious, and that everyone expects you to present your material in your ghetto field, in your little ghetto space. I know it is one of the hardest things for, especially an academic, to admit. But admitting it is liberating if you're going to do something about it. And I mean, I could just go on for example after example after example in my career. I would, and I've been, invited to all the typical prestigious things that make a resume look good, but where any of these invitations, or the vast majority of for a long time in my career at least, the irony of it is that once it became clear that I am no gap filler, and I would start, the invitations became far less. And I'm sorry, but this is a racial colonial issue that, is another topic. But the word got around that, this is not a Muslim nice boy that's just going to, when you start arguing with people about what scholars of Judaism have said about the scholar that they're citing, and saying, yeah, but he was criticized for this, and well, he misread this source, and and so on and so forth, it becomes a different dynamic. And I don't know. I'm obviously not going to see it in my lifetime, because I think I'm just going to be out of time. But I've dreamt of just the transparency and honesty that Muslims would just admit to themselves that
I remember when you were having a conversation with Bernard Lewis in Washington, D.C. in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And it was hosted by I think it was a Jewish organization, right? Like a think tank or something.
Right.
And
One of them. Yeah.
Somehow you overheard someone refer to you as a work in progress.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? So, and interestingly, it was like, it was a conversation. It was like at one of the, like, I can't remember, national, like, journalism center or something like that. It was a big deal. And it was interesting because the way that Bernard Lewis conversed with you, he chose to agree with you, like he would find whatever he could agree with you so as not to engage you.
Yeah.
And so it was a really, like, it was a very low impact kind of conversation that was useful for them on their side, but it was very interesting. So
Yeah, I mean, he whatever I said he agreed with, just to neutralize me.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually said that I'm not being taken seriously. You are agreeing with everything I say, but ignoring the normative direction of my argument. But anyway, with that work in progress comment, they were discussing whether I am, quote unquote, a good Muslim or a lost cause. One of them. And Bernard Lewis said, and I overheard it because, well, they were speaking in Hebrew. And he said that Khaled is not to be trusted right now, but he's a work in progress. And meant that, maybe he will turn out to be a Muslim who says the right things and do the right things. And Grace knows about it because it's one of the times that I was very upset, and Grace said, "What's wrong?" And I told her, "This is all a sham. This is just these people. It's just a sham. This is about getting a native informant working to prepare a native informant to be a native informant, and not about any serious intellectual or moral engagement." all the degrees, all the accolades, all that, it didn't matter. It was, yeah. So
Okay. Sharif, question?
Given our secular society where God is marginalized heavily in various arenas, this is regarding verse 221. So do we need to re-examine the criteria for what constitutes what's translated as an idolater and idolatress within the context of marriage?
So what, in the context of marriage, I remind myself what, okay. Oh, okay, I get what you're saying. So 221 is the ayah in Surah Baqarah that says that do not marry an idolater, and that Muslim men should not marry an idolater and mushrikat, and Muslim women should not marry an idolater, either a mushrikeen. And so Sharif is asking whether idolatry in modern society means something different. Well, I mean, idolatry in the historical context. Well, obviously, it had referred to those who engage in idol worshiping, and that historical practice. Human beings have evolved. That now, interestingly, practices Christian reverence, because often the argument you get, well, how about Catholicism and some of the way that they relate to figures, especially, or reverence of the cross, isn't this a form of idolatry? But it's historically existed, and yet that is not what I believe Allah was referring to when Allah was talking about idolatry or mushrikeen. So it referred specifically to the form of idolatry that existed in this historical context. I think morally, if I am advising someone who's asking me for advice, or advising my children as to partners to marry, I would advise them that while human beings in the modern age no longer worship idols in the historical sense, there is a far more pernicious idol that human beings worship in the modern age. That's a stark materialism of everything. And I can't say it's, as a legal matter, it's haram, but what I would say is that as a moral matter, if you want Allah to be a third partner in your marriage, Ishraq billah, associating partners with Allah, where your value system ultimately, and there are plenty of even Muslims that do this, that where ultimately their value system doesn't derive from any type of engagement with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but when all is said and done, it derives from a basic commitment to material self-interest. everything is defined in reference to the I. And I feel, I know it's what the I dictates. And I do think that that's not a blessed marriage. I don't, I can't say it's as a legal matter, it cannot be recognized, but I can say that I think you are going down the wrong path. Yeah. Let's leave it at that.
Thank you, Sheikh. I'm going to try and unjumble questions. One question I had that came to my mind when you mentioned Tujjar Kalam, like those who essentially make it their business to be in the state of philosophizing and theosophizing everything. And towards the end of the second page, so فَمَا رَبِحَتْ تِجَارَتُهُمْ وَمَا كَانُوا مُهْتَدِينَ, for example. I was wondering whether you felt that there was a connection in that, just because you situated the surah in a way that spoke about the Jewish scholars and how they essentially made it their business to reverse engineer their theology to be the prominent one versus an approach. And what does that say in terms of modern scholarship amongst Muslims who are always kind of trying to reverse engineer their understanding so essentially, like we've spoken about this before in private, about picking and choosing, especially in Baqarah, picking and choosing verses without context in order to support a really massive theological claim. Things like imama, for example.
No.
And beyond that, I had another question in terms of, again, the start of Baqarah makes a lot of mention about iman and who are the people who are mu'mineen, and the overall message in regards to amana. The amana that Muslims should carry, that the Jews fail to carry but still have the opportunity to retake, and the initial moments in which the Qur'an starts to use the term Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, so Ya ayyuhan nas, or something like that. Do you believe that there is a relationship between the concept of amana and the usage of the terms alladhina amanu, or the terms like yu'minuna, this kind of thing, that it's not just in the lame way that we kind of translate it in belief, if you simply believe this, etc., but rather that mu'minun bear the message, they bear an amana. Is there a direct connection in that regards? I don't know in terms of linguistically, but in terms of looking at the overall structure of the surah, does it lend itself to possibly making a connection there?
Paraphrase a little bit.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to paraphrase. Well, okay, so the first issue was what? I forgot. What was the first?
The first is, what did I say?
The Jewish scholars.
Yeah, the Tujjar al-Kalam.
Tujjar al-Kalam, yeah.
فَمَا رَبِحَتْ تِجَارَتُهُمْ.
Yeah, so and reverse engineering. Okay, so the first question is the selectivity in constructing argument. Shayani used the expression reverse engineering. The second is about the mu'minun, when Surah Baqarah uses the term mu'minun and carrying the amana, the trust. Okay, but the first issue, let's Tujjar al-Kalam usually as an expression relates to people who spin talk and as in Surah Al-Shu'ara, that would be what we talked about in Surah Al-Shura. That would be tujar kalam, people who employ language as an instrument of obtaining results that have nothing to do with principled positions or with what actually is a matter of conviction and so on. But reverse, I think what you're referring to in reverse engineering is something different, because what here is intended is the tendency to search, to go and basically co-opt parts of the Quran. And we had an example of this in the issue of mulk. So Allah said, يُؤْتِ الْمُلْكَ مَنْ يَشَاءُ, to then co-opt this and say, well, Allah is the one who decides who is in power, and whoever Allah. So then, attempting to remove whoever is in power, or attempting to hold that person accountable, is somehow a defiance of Allah, and to then co-opt Qur'anic language. The same thing happens in the issue of imama. And the same thing actually happens in so many other different issues that relate to legal matters in Sharia. So to often the language of the Quran on a specific issue is co-opted to support an institution, regardless of the moral message, the moral thrust of the entire, not just surah, but the entire Quran itself. And then what we end up with, of course, is instead of a coherent argument about the moral trajectory of the Quran, what the Quran wants to achieve morally and ethically, in a coherent view that one can look at and say, okay, I understand what God demands of us in terms of these broad ethical issues. We end up with a very disjointed, often inconsistent and often incoherent support for specific institutions, regardless of the moral trajectory of the Quran. And that's precisely the type of problem that we end up in. It's remarkable, and we saw an example of that. Perhaps the most prominent issue, in my view, is the moral trajectory of the Quran in demanding that you cannot live your life and let the poor be poor. It is just not acceptable. But yet, a segmented approach to the Quran can justify as we speak, there are displaced human beings living in highly inadequate tents in the heart of the Muslim world, and winter has come in, and everyone knows that there are children who are going to die in this winter. Many Syrian children, many Yemeni children, many Iraqis, and yet the Muslim world is oblivious, and it is oblivious precisely because the Quran is no longer a moral agent. Very quote-unquote pious people can sit and can teach the Quran and can feel completely oblivious to displaced human beings, to refugees, to destitute human beings, to orphans. Look at the problem of orphans in the moral trajectory of the Quran. it is as if the Quran is saying Allah will not bless a people that do not take care of their orphans. The Muslim world is one of the worst parts of the world in terms of taking care of orphans. No one can tell me that the Quran continues to play a role. If most Muslims live and die having never visited an orphanage. Well, if you've actually visited orphanages in many Muslim countries, from Egypt to Iraq to Morocco to Tunisia, you will see things that will scar you for life. Muslim orphanages in Muslim countries are structured where child abuse and corruption by basically even the police force and I've worked on this, the police forces in Muslim countries think of orphans as subhuman. And there are the shuyukh that are appointed to work in orphanages are often the most corrupt shuyukh. How in a society which has the adhan blaring 5 times a day, and you have, this is supposed to be societies of the Quran. So, and the answer is this segmented approach. It's the Quran is not a moral agent. It's not a living, breathing, moral entity that is powerful, working in society. Similarly, the issue of despotism. There is no way you can study the Quran, and we've encountered numerous, even in Surah Al-Baqarah, just Surah Al-Baqarah, and end up endorsing the idea of an elite ruling beyond accountability. I mean, the Quran has condemned this left and right, up and down, crossways, sideways, every other way. But yet, Muslim societies, again, have an endemic problem with despotism and lack of accountability. How is that possible? Well, then if you segment the Quran and break it down into like little compartments, each compartment has nothing to do with the other, then it becomes possible. So yeah, that is an immense problem, and this is why this is a moral project. It is trying to rekindle the role of the Quran as a moral agent in our lives, because otherwise I don't know what God does in our lives. If God is basically about salah and so on and so on, that just seems like rendering God to such a marginal role, and it is not about applying the technicalities of Sharia, because again, technicalities of Sharia are exactly that, just positive laws. But positive laws are supposed to mean something, and if you don't have the meaning, then the positive laws are just a form of hawa, a form of whimsy. That was this is the reverse. The iman. It is clear in Surah Al-Baqarah in particular that what Surah Al-Baqarah is saying is that there was an amana, there was this trust that was that the part and parcel of the iman of the Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ, and the iman that all the prophets have come to affirm is to bear this amana, and that it is explaining why the Israelites no longer bear the amana, and why now Allah is charging Muslims with bearing it. And it is clear that Allah, so it is talking, when it talks about al-mu'minun, it is talking about those who are now bearing the amana in this context around the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Now, what happens when you say, I believe, but you do not necessarily bear an amana? And that's it's sort of the dissonance, the cognitive dissonance that you get into. So you say, I believe in Allah, but if you believe in Allah, in the same way that you must believe in in that there is hereafter, that there is hisab, in the same way that believing in Allah it entails a certain package, you must also believe that Allah offered an amana, has an amana, and that. But what if, as a believer, as a mu'min or someone who believes in Allah, you have no clue what this amana is about? And it's not that you don't have it is because the epistemological framework for educating you upon this amana. So, as far as you wonder, is amana just paying my zakah? Is that it? Is amana going to Eid prayer? Is amana going to Jumu'ah prayer if I can? Is amana having potlucks in the local mosque? Is that the amana? What if that? And you really have a breakdown in coherence, and you don't know what to do with that breakdown in coherence, because amana is the entire moral edifice that is presented, that was built up by the entire Meccan Qur'an, and that reaches fruition in Surah Baqarah. And that when Allah addresses the matter of al-birr and tells us that the heart of this amana is this essential concept of birr, and that birr itself as a concept entails adala and ihsan and all the things that we've talked about. That assumes a Qur'anic education that either you attain because you are sufficiently anchored in the language and frame of references of the Qur'an to read the Qur'an and pick it up on your own immediately, or because there is an educational institutions that get you to that point. We don't have either of these. We are alienated from the language of the Qur'an. The modern, even the let's say an Arab that grew up doesn't know a word of English, is sufficiently alienated from the entire moral universe of the Quran. And so leave alone everyone else. And at the same time, we don't have the educational institutions that allow us to bridge that gap. And that puts us back in the what do we invest in? I mean, this was in Grace Wonders in 2012, 2013. I started becoming obsessed with counting how many institutions exist for the study of the Torah and institutions exist for the study of the Bible in the world, and comparing it with institutions dedicated to the study of the Quran in the world. And frankly, I dropped the project after about 8 months of research just because of depression. I became so depressed because I was counting, even in the most secular places like France, private money has created some, institutions for biblical studies, and I'm not talking about secular, academic, UCLA type schools. I'm talking about seminaries and various think tanks and institutes and so on and so forth. Compared to the Muslim world, where if the government doesn't create something, nothing exists. Zilch, zero. And it just makes you then, in order to, because I didn't want to become one of those people who just says, oh, all Muslims are hypocrites and, starting calling everyone a kafir, like people who lose their mind. I said, okay, I'm quit. This is too depressing. So for a while I was chasing down. I even had research assistants that helped me with this. Investing, what you invested, says so much about you.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We're back for round 2. So, Rami, do you want to come up with your question? We're going to finish here with questions here, and then we'll move to the interactive group and others that have been submitted, inshallah.
We talked a lot about the covenant in Baqarah, and in Christianity and Judaism, the theology of the covenant is kind of like core. But there doesn't really seem to be a theology, like the covenant doesn't factor so much into, it hasn't been theorized or elaborated, I think, as much in the Islamic tradition. When you look up, in the tafsir, it's always about, was it an actual physical or real occasion? Was it allegorical? Did all of Adam's progeny come out, or what was the mithaq? Apart, I think, from the Sufis talk about it, but is there a reason for that, or am I wrong? Is there actually a lot written on it?
The question is, in Judaism and Christianity, the idea of the covenant has been its core in both Jewish and Christian theology. But in the Islamic context, Rami is saying that it is not sufficiently theorized, and that it is okay. So take a step back. It is true that Sufis talk about the al-amana or al-mithaq more than others. And it is true that in a lot of the tafsir literature, you have these typically very medieval type discussions about whether this was an actual literal event or a figurative thing, whether they're and some fantastical reports about what the amana was and so on. That is amorphic in nature, that amorphizes the amana and it makes it as if it was a physical thing. Anyway, but the mithaq or al-ahd or the amana does feature quite prominently in the writings of someone like Ghazali in his Ihya. It features quite prominently in Qadi Abdul Jabbar's Al-Mughni. It is a consistently discussed theme, such as in Tusi's book text, Al-Malakut al-Ilahi, and so on. And the discussions have the earmarks of carry the earmark of their time. They're mostly discussions written in the 10th century, 12th century, some 14th century, and they are not constructed like theological discussions that are 16th century and post 16th century. They're very much constructed like the discussions of that you would expect in this era. In other words, they are often the discussions about whether the relation of the imana to as-sifat al-ilahiyya, to divine attributes, discussions about at-takhalluq bi khuluqillah, whether we have an obligation to reflect these divine attributes, to encompass and animate these divine attributes, whether al-khulq al-hasan is a part of these, whether at-tamkin fil ard is part of these divine attributes, and so on and so forth. Tamkin fil ard meaning being empowered, and so on. Now, if you compare the Islamic pre-modern medieval discussions on the covenant and two Christian and Jewish discussions written around the same period, what is striking is the similarity in style, not necessarily in content, but in style. So in Judaism, the covenant focuses in this context that all the discussions that you find in Judaism and written in the pre-Maimonides, and there are not many of them, by the way, but the ones that are there, it's always about the idea of a chosen people and the promise of the nature of God's promise to the chosen people. And in Christianity, the covenant is always this idea of salvation through Christ, where you start finding a theoretical working through what the covenant entails. In Christianity, is post-Thomas Aquinas, and in Judaism is post-Maimonides, and so they become the reason we say that in Christianity and Judaism the covenant is an essential part of Christian and Jewish theology. It is not because of what was written in the medieval period, but it is because of what modernistic scholars said about the medieval period in Christianity and in Judaism. So when you read Christian theologians writing in the 19th century, writing in the 20th century, what they're claiming about their tradition is that the covenant has always been core to the theology. When you go and actually look up the sources that they are citing, you are struck by the fact that they have the same style. You're struck by how similar they are to Islamic discourses. So you have like the same trajectory in the pre-modern world. All three, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, are talking about the covenant in similar ways. The big difference is that Muslims come at the wake of modernity, and they are saddled by colonialism and their discourses. And in fact, the way they relate to their historical period, their historical tradition, it becomes discombobulated. It loses all coherence. Either they just repeat what their medieval sources said, or if they try to theorize, they are basically then taking what Western scholars are saying and reproducing these discourses, paraphrasing. And whether but you can always tell whether they are actually citing to these scholars, which some of them did, or they just plagiarizing the material without citing to the scholars. But if you've read the original, you can always tell which scholar they're plagiarizing. Christian theology and Jewish theology were challenged by modernity, and insiders to the tradition did not feel like they had to consistently that their position as insiders is suspect and needed vindication. In other words, why are we committed to this tradition? And they were claiming whatever they wanted to claim about the historical tradition without basically the narrative on their own history belonging to someone else, because Muslim theology, history of Muslim theology and history of Muslim philosophy and the history of Muslim law were all written by non-Muslims in the West, not by Muslims. So this is the critical difference. It is not true that taken out of its intellectual history that the covenant features prominently in Christianity and Judaism, but not in Islam. They're pretty much on the same level until we get into the modern age, and then without a doubt, what Jewish scholars did with Maimonides' legacy, for instance, is far more sophisticated than what Muslim scholars did with Ghazali. I mean, till now, Muslims are still stuck on whether it's Ibn Rushd or Ghazali, which is a very historically idiotic discussion. Whether if we would have gone by the way of Ibn Rushd, Muslims would have been backwards or not. Again, from a historical perspective, makes absolutely no sense. Whether Ghazali is responsible for why Muslims are backwards, again, from a historical discussion, from a historical perspective, absolutely makes no sense. And it's like kindergarten discourses compared to what you see in their Christian and Jewish counterparts. I don't know, I mean, can you imagine a Jewish scholar writing about whether Maimonides is responsible for a philosophical non-accomplishment in Judaism today? I mean, people would look at this historical argument like your causal lines, your analysis of causation is just absurd and childish. But it happens in the Islamic context all the time. I mean, we actually remain stuck in it.
This is amazing because as you laid it out, I mean, on the one hand, you can go, God, darn those stupid Muslims, why haven't they done anything? On the other hand, it's interesting because it's like, okay, Maimonides and Thomas Aquinas, we know were both very heavily influenced by the Islamic tradition, as you've told us, right? And
yeah.
So they were able to go back and make sense of their medieval tradition. And if you extend like the timeline past us, someone could easily, this is, I think, the challenge before us, is that, okay, well, I mean, Ghazali and Ibn Rushd were, not in our time frame, but if we talk about our time, this, tafsir could be the opportunity for then the Muslim scholars, especially the young Muslim scholars, to come forward and say, okay, let's take this and look back and make this covenant, sophisticated and meaningful for our time.
I want to say that this tafsir just deals with the Quran, but people don't when we talk about post Maimonides intellectual achievements or post Thomas Aquinas intellectual achievements, you are talking about a community, large communities of scholars. The way scholarship develops is not, there's no one scholar that becomes the hero of everything. That idea is, it is the fact that there is a community of scholars that literally discourse with one another, that literally engage one another, and that inspires that process of disagreement, or that's what inspires the development of sophisticated ideas. Any scholar working as an isolated soul, by definition, their accomplishments lack the rigor of interactive intellectual dynamics. So if you really wanted, ideally, there would be, a whole community of people that would interact with various ideas and say, you got it wrong here, you got it right here, but what happens in Muslim communities is that we often are, we don't have that critical mass of intellectuals engaging. We still have the phenomena of, a Muhammad Abdu that emerges, and Muhammad Abdu would be Muhammad Abdu, or a Kawakibi that emerges, or Khairuddin al-Tunisi would emerge, and so they're all isolated figures, not in conversation actively and dynamically with each other, because of the lack of a critical mass. And because often even the person that emerges is a one-off, it's like just one that pushes the envelope, but it is always easy to ignore the one-offs, and I pray that that's not what happens to this tafsir, because the lack of a critical mass is a major problem.
Yeah, the fact that we're working towards this tafsir, which is the first original contribution in 40 years, is, that in itself is very telling, because, as you've said so often, there hasn't been much original thought, developed in our tradition, and it feels like, and we're still in the, in colonialism, so we're still not writing about our own tradition, we still don't own our discourses, and it seems that there isn't anything that, like, even the youth are not excited about anything. So these are the things that are hopeful for me, because obviously I'm not a scholar, and I can, look and point to Joe and Rami and say, okay guys, this is your job, but it's like exciting for me to think that, as a layperson, here's something to build from.
We still, so many of our khatibs and our, whatever you want to call it, imams or whatever, they still begin every time they talk with a very telling dua, that every muhdasa is a bid'ah, and every bid'ah fi nar, that everything new is a bid'ah, and every bid'ah is in hellfire. And I know that they base this on the hadith, which is a different matter. The fact that we still consider this to be a hadith is a problem. But what do you do with the people that start out their frame of their framework is anything new is problematic, is presumptively a problem. And anything new, I understand if that what they're saying is, if someone wants to make Dhuhr 5 rakahs instead of 4 rakahs, I understand that's the muhdas and that's the bid'ah. But people say it. The reason a lot of these imams repeat it is because they affirm to themselves the value of intellectual laziness. What they're actually saying, but without confessing it, is I am justified in reading the same books that have been read for now centuries, Riyadh al-Salihin and, things like that. الترغيب والترهيب by الذهبي and because anything new is presumptively. So when you say the first new tafsir, there's a very good reason that there is nothing new. Is that we collectively we still affirm a culture in which any new original insight is presumptively a problem. And that's why I never repeat this dua in anything that in any of the khutbahs, and partly because but because it also has become an affirmation of a very problematic moral and intellectual attitude.
Well, I'm going to put on my hat as a resident cheerleader because I think for people like that, it's been too long for people who just affirmatively say everything new is a bid'ah. I feel like we've reached a point of crisis and that we shouldn't listen to that anymore. And now you've presented an alternative where it speaks to heart and mind and soul. It's based on the tradition. It's well documented. You referenced so many different tafsir, so many different scholars. You've given us an opportunity, you've added something to our toolkit where now we can go and say no. And obviously what has been happening is not working. We've lost our smart minds, and just even the people sitting in this audience with us today, our extended family members, as we've said, that have come, are in the top, percentages of brainiacs and pious souls. And this is where I find hope, is that people who come and they hear something that is stimulating intellectually and also exciting and inspiring inside. This is what can be the hope for the future. So when you explain to us, okay, the difference, because the covenant is not articulated so prominently in the Islamic tradition versus the Christian and Jewish tradition, it seems to me it's just because it hasn't been done by, and it can easily be done now, or more easily be done by our young scholars who now have been empowered and given license from these halakas to say, it's in your hand. You take this, and God is giving you license to be on the front lines of, of intellect and beauty and reasonableness, and here you go. Let's, so this is where I find my hope, and I hope that others feel that as well, because I didn't know this before. It's like, okay, someone just needs to, Rami, this is your question. You gotta develop the covenant. But it's beautiful, and it's hopeful, and it's exciting. So sorry for my 2 cents. I'm not doing the hard work. I'm just like, Rami, go for it. Okay, did you have another question, Sheree?
The majority of modern psychology is, not even modern psychology, but psychology from the beginning was built within the infrastructure of capitalism. And there's a lot of critics in psychological arenas that critique this. That basically one of the main problems is that we compartmentalize people and treat them as if their problems are just individual without looking at the larger society, and reduce everything to a list of symptoms. and then treat those symptoms. And that's essentially what these different psychological disorders are. And so, and even the fact that whether we call them disorders or not, I mean, if someone is suffering in a certain way, whether it's depression or an anxiety disorder, but they're in a society that is fundamentally ill, can you even really call that a disorder? But all of that said, my main question is, in the context of what we have learned so far with the Meccan surahs in this surah, and what the Muslims were going through in terms of persecution and torture, and they were not obviously in healthy psychological conditions. Yet repeatedly the Qur'anic message that's coming to them is don't abandon your moral obligation. So when I see a lot of Islamic psychology programs, because I mean they're sprouting up everywhere, and I think that the majority of them kind of try to introduce irtiqa into the paradigm of modern psychology. Number one, do you think that they're compatible? Do you think that psychology as it is practiced today is compatible with irtiqa and what we learn, and do you think that actually, is it right to assume that can be a treatment to psychological disorders? And number two, do you think that Islamically, I mean, if we're talking about Islamic psychology, are we putting the cart before the horse? Because it seems like through the Quran, Allah is telling us, no, what needs to come first is your covenant. Does that mean that we have to be willing to sacrifice our mental health for the sake of the covenant?
No, I mean, I don't know. This is something that has to be taken up by people, by someone like you, people who can actually delve into the whole phenomena of Islamized psychology and whether they present meaningful alternatives and so on. All I can say is that first, this issue of mental health and the covenant. Do we sacrifice mental health and because of the covenant? If I am raised with the idea that my meaning, the way I relate to myself, is intimately interconnected with my understanding of my Maker and what my Maker expects of me and wants from me. And that, as Surah Baqarah reminds us, that if I'm committed to my Maker is committed to me, and that Allah is ever present and that Allah is ever close. Does that sacrifice mental health? I mean, it's like if you take if you are conditioning people to the idea of a commitment, an idea of a cause, an idea of a purpose, an idea of a goal, I think it's a stretch to say that you sacrifice mental health. What you are sacrificing is, a lot of times you cannot consider your own comfort without considering the way that your comfort relates to many other factors. There was a period of time when I was curious about psychology enough that I actually went there was one part that wasn't curiosity, but another part that was curiosity. So I actually would go and visited several counselors or psychologists, and I found the way that I was raised very alien to them, and what they were telling me very alien to me, by always constantly emphasizing how does that make you feel, and the focus. I remember one psychologist at Yale, I was describing to her how much my mother sacrificed for her children, and she made a comment that effectively what she was saying is that basically that there are some people who addicted to a form of self-punishment, that she's, by sacrificing so much for her children, she's punishing herself. That, and of course, to emphasize that you sacrifice for, and it is a whole philosophical outlook. And of course, eventually I stopped doing it because, I was reading enough. I started out first, like most people, reading Freud, and then got sick of Freud. He's a good entertainment, but that's it. And then you elevate a bit to Jungian philosophy, and then Kierkegaard came in at some point. But anyway, and then you start going to psychologists and you start arguing with them philosophically, and then of course that doesn't make for so
Good therapy.
yeah. Anyway. So, no, I don't think that you can put it as sacrificing mental health. You don't sacrifice mental health. It is, in fact, I believe, in my experience, it is when the times that I felt sorry for myself and was very tempted to sink into depression, the ethic that, well, you cannot indulge because what you do relates to so many other people, and that you owe obligations to so many other people, and that it is just simply not in your book to do what it is not sacrificing mental health. It is often grabbing yourself by the bootstraps and just but Islamic psychology and the whole concept of irtiqa, and whether it, the little that I've read of what Muslim psychologists have written, again, the thing that aggravates me the most about it is that it is not theoretically sophisticated. That, in other words, if I am measuring it by the yardstick of a good academic book, like, I go and I get a good academic study on psychology. It is layered, it is sophisticated, it is nuanced, it is a journey into arguments and counter arguments and so on. What I read written by Muslims is not like that. what I've read written by Muslims, it's more the ghetto phenomena. Like, it's the phenomena of hodgepodge. In Arabic we call it talziq. You take something from here and you slap something on here and slap something on here, and there is no serious theoretical or analytical. If this was peer reviewed, it wouldn't pass muster. If this was something that was offered to be published by an academic press, by Cambridge or Oxford or something, it would not be published. That's the problem I have. As a non-specialist, that I want Muslims to write things that academic presses would say, because I know that I've read things written from especially a Christian and Jewish perspective. Counseling, Christian counseling. And it's far more sophisticated than the stuff that I've read written by Muslims. I've read a couple of books on a Jewish take on modern psychology. And one of the books in particular I have in my library, it was a journey through all the major schools of psychology that developed in the West and contributions of Jews that were non-Jewish. So the author was very critical of Jewish psychologists who he argued made non-Jewish contributions, and his argument how they could have made Jewish contributions to the field of psychology. One of the biggest people he criticizes is Freud himself, which he calls him a self-hating Jew. And he says that if Freud would have anchored himself in the Jewish tradition, his contributions would have been far more significant, far more meaningful. And you feel like you've taken a journey in that is philosophically satisfying, historically satisfying, just satisfying to you as an intellectual. It is, and it was published. I don't remember. It was either, I think it was Oxford, if I remember serves me right. And it's a very thick book. I mean, it's about 500 pages or so. Nothing like that exists. Why? My question is, why? Why? I mean, it's a bit absurd. Why is it that it is always when you find something Islamic, it is sort of like in these like, under the table publications that I don't know. I mean, so that's my skepticism now. But I hope that people who specialize in this field can address it.
Okay. Last call for in-person questions before we move on to the next. Anybody?
خلاص.
Extended
They've had
family?
enough. Go on.
All right.
We've heard enough from them.
Okay. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We got a lot more than we actually will get through. Rami did an incredible job of putting things together, cleaning them up. So I think we have some really, really great questions. First one, could the Sheikh please explain verse 259 as it was not covered during the halaqas? And I was excited to hear his explanation.
You didn't cover it?
So if this was because you were rushing, you're going to be in big trouble.
Yeah, I did skip it.
Ah.
Yeah.
See, people are paying attention. So
Yeah.
You tried to sneak past that one.
Okay. Let me see if I. Yeah. Okay. There is. I'll take this now. I'm doing a mini tafsir, so. Okay. there are a number of traditions. Interestingly, though, many of them are, again, within the rubric of the Israelite traditions and Israeliyat, because they were either traditions that mirror something found in the Talmudic tradition, and not the Torah but the Talmud, or because they were transmitted by Jewish converts to Islam, but in this situation there were Jewish converts that transmitted something that was very close to what's in the Talmudic tradition, and typically in these traditions they are then attributed to either the Prophet ﷺ or one of the companions of the Prophet who relates the Talmudic narrative. And the narratives on this, where, what location, there's nothing reliable. Some say that this was in what is part of today's Iraq. Some say it was part of today's Sham or Syria. There's a couple of traditions say no, that this was in part of today's Yemen. And who precisely this person that was passing, other than the claim that he was an Israelite, that's it. But that the narrative refers to an individual who goes to an abandoned town after its inhabitant has long deserted it, and that he now, again, depending on what version you're looking at, this town was a town that has been sacked by the Persians in the destruction of the Second Temple. Was it a town that was pre the Persian invasion and was sacked by the Romans, as some traditions say? Was it a town that was not sacked by the Persians or Romans, but simply a deserted town for no good reasons? Again, you get different versions. But anyway, he either, depending on the version you're reading, he looks in this town at skeletons of people that were killed in the invasion, or that he looks at grave sites of people that had been buried in this town, but the inhabitants of the town have moved on, and so the grave sites are sort of decrepit and falling apart, and wonders whether, how is it possible, or questions, or and most of the reports say that this was a pious person who was taken by a moment of doubt, and that, as it says, then he was effectively died for 100 years, only to be resurrected after 100 years. And the way that he realizes that he had died for that long is he looks at the skeleton of his donkey and sees, and of course his food is long deteriorated, but the skeleton of his donkey tells him that he has been, that a long time has passed. And that this is a demonstration of God's power of resurrection. Now, of course, this reminds us very much of the story of the cave, which we've talked about. a very similar narrative. Several mufassirun, because nothing reliable has been transmitted that tells us that in fact that it is referring to any of what these reports said that it's referring to. In other words, a Talmudic story. Gave the story, and it's this especially, you find this in the Sufi tradition and also in the Razi, Zamakhshari, modern interpreters like Muhammad Abdu, understood it in a far more allegorical way, that or as Muhammad Abdu says, that when Allah refers to an event and says, look at this person, such and such happened to them, but doesn't tell us anything about this person, doesn't give us any details, doesn't reference any historical event, then part of Allah's message is that the historical event is not important. But rather, all the ways that death overcomes a person, whether physical death, or as Sufis always say, that especially this expression, khawiyatun ala urushiha, that khawiyatun ala urushiha is a very powerful expression. It is like saying, look, it is completely, its foundations have been laid bare and there is nothing there. That expression has even entered in literary usage to refer to a state of emptiness, a state where, whether it's moral emptiness, emotional emptiness, intellectual emptiness, you can use that expression in all these contexts. And so someone like Muhammad Abdu says that, and also Sayyid Qutb has a very similar argument, and I think he probably picked it up from Muhammad Abdu. It says that this allegorical narrative, the reason the history is not important, is that it is not just a town that could be as if abandoned and emptied of all meaning, but the inner being of a human being itself can be completely emptied of all meaning. And Allah is reminding you, that is why look at this ayah is sandwiched between an ayah before it and an ayah after it that talks about Ibrahim alayhi salam, and Ibrahim's Ibrahim's whether literal or figurative, Ibrahim's doubts and Ibrahim's growth into conviction and belief. And that this is not coincidental, but rather the critical issue is what doubt could make of a human being. You could be plagued by doubt, and that doubt becomes an instrumentality for growth, for inhabiting the uninhabited. Or doubt could empty your soul and heart of all meaning, so your your function as a human being becomes a doubting human being. What is it that you do? I doubt. I am not sure of anything. And when you are not sure of anything, you become like that decayed donkey or rotted food. There's a being, but it's empty of real life. That's basically so if you look at Tabari goes through all the Israelite traditions. Ibn Kathir has a shorter review, but even someone like Tafsir al-Baghawi, who's or someone like Shukani, it was prominent to them that Allah did not give us any indicators as to who this person is, where, how, when, as if it is entirely irrelevant. And all those who said, well, it's referring to this narrative, even if it's put in the mouth of the Prophet ﷺ, they found parallels in the Talmudic tradition by shubha. In other words, they found a narrative that seemed similar in the Talmud, and the Talmud is full of narratives like this, by the way. And they say, oh well, it must be it, but perhaps that misses the entire point. The entire point is this critical phrase, al-khawi ala urushiha. Something where the foundations are laid bare. What is inside your own town? Your what inhabits you? Years ago when Grace was, she asked this question that jogged my memory as to the journey. The image that I sort of emerged about this area in particular is there are so many people. If we could take a visual picture of what inhabits the heart, and it would be as if abandoned homes and carcasses of living things. They wake up, they go someplace, work, they come back from work, they are on autopilot. They're doing function after function after function, but there's nothing there. And as opposed to a town that is bristling with life, with everything that represents life, which in the Qur'anic outlook is always meaning. Life is meaning. So, good catch.
That better have been the only one. Okay. Second question. Does no compulsion in religion deal with compulsion in religious practice or belief, as well as compulsion in entering and leaving the religion? How would this relate to the use of shame and exclusion in Muslim spaces to pressure Muslims to behave in certain ways and to believe in a certain school of doctrine? Does the law of no compulsion in religion relate to spiritual abuse that is sometimes used in families and mosques?
Yeah. لا إكراه في الدين قد تبين الرشد من الغي. In order to unpack لا إكراه في الدين, when you complete the phrase قد تبين الرشد من الغي, the path of what is right is clear and the path of what is wrong is clear. it is a rushd. A rushd is what is correct. A rushd is what is rational. A rushd is what is all of this is encompassed by the word rushd, by the way. Rushd is what is reasonable. Rushd is what is balanced. Rushd is what is fair. Rushd is what is just. That expression, rushd, is like saying, what is fundamentally good. Al-ghay is what is false, what's a lie, what's unfair, what's dishonest, what's deceitful, a whole set of qualities. And so, لا إكراه في الدين قد تبين الرشد من الغي. It's as if it is not the deen that our modern mind brackets religion and then says, well, this is religion and this is everything else. We compartmentalize. It is noteworthy that a deen here is equated with rushd, which is like all affairs of life that so when we go back to, we talked about the intent of the author. Allah reminds us, when Allah wants to say, whoever wants to believe, believes, and whoever doesn't want to believe, doesn't believe, Allah says so, clearly and repeatedly in the Quran. مَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. So this is as belief and as opposed to not belief. But when the Quran condemns ikrah, it is like saying, if you have deen in you, you will not practice coercion. This is different from the way the legalistic mind understood it, because the legalistic mind wanted to know what positive actual laws can be derived from it. But a moralistic mind would understand la ikrah fi din if it's seen as describing a moral character. It is telling you, if you have deen in you, coercion is not a good state of affair. It's like if I tell you لا كذب في الدين, there's no lying in religion. How would you understand it? You would understand it that if you have religion, you shouldn't lie. But the way the legalistic frame of mind biases the way that we understand this phrase. So it is the ethic that coercion is not the path of a sirat, that coercion it is as a way of obtaining results is, to say the least, suspect. So the things that you mentioned, when we insist on, when we use even the very ethic of authoritarianism and despotism and censorship, and so I haven't encountered in any Muslim context when people are talking about, let's say, whether we can control what people say on our in our khutbahs or not, right? I have never encountered Muslims say, well, Allah has taught us the ethic of non-coercion, so how does this mix into our considerations? Rather, it is never discussed. It is as if it is as if we have Qur'anic prescriptions, but other than the allegorical examples that were given to us by medieval jurists, manifesting these Quranic prescriptions in specific laws, our intellect no longer relates to these Quranic prescriptions. So they don't address our soul anymore. While la ikrah fi din affects, if Allah is telling me this, it affects the way I relate to my wife, it affects the way I relate to my children, it affects the way I relate to my students, it affects the way I relate even, recently I had to turn in a student for missing too much class, too many days of class, to the dean. I sat and thought about La Ikraha fi Din as I was writing the email to the dean, telling the dean about the student missing too many days of class. Whether that's coercion, that I have a right to practice getting the student in trouble or not. That I think, Allahu A'lam, but that I think is a far more authentic understanding of La Ikrah fi Din than what we're accustomed to. I mean, I've never we've been married, you told me 27 years?
I think almost 27.
27?
Coming up on 27.
Yeah, 27. I've never told Grace what to wear, what to eat, what to say, and it is not the issue is not whether Grace would allow me to or not allow me to. She wouldn't, but I think. But I'm scared of her most of the time. No, okay. That's another matter. It's
Don't lie.
It's la ikrah fi din. I mean, I can't relate to human beings through ikra. And maybe sometimes, especially when I question myself whether maybe I should have had a little bit more coercion with my sons. I don't know, but it was always very difficult for me to even exercise coercive authority. And again, it's because La Ikrah fi Din torments me. It interrogates me consistently.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that have to do with usury and finance. So I'm going to actually put them together so you can answer as you like. Since we have a lot of questions, maybe this will help maximize the time. So the first one is there a connection between usury and the obsession with profits being satanic and shaitan promising poverty? There is an argument that one of the greatest causes of inequality in wealth in Western countries is due to the use of debt and interest rates. Is the Quran saying that this financial system and moral precedent of taking advantage of people's needs leads to poverty, not just for particular individuals, but for the majority of society? And then the second question is, one of the well-known scholars of Islamic finance has defined riba as usury amounting to economic exploitation rather than simple increase, particularly of the modest kind provided for according to modern banking practice. Is this correct? Does riba refer only to high interest rates and not low interest rates? And what do we do with the small amount of money given to us by banks in the form of interest? And then related to that is the whole idea of fintech, or cryptocurrency, non-fungible tokens, decentralized finance, which is still new and still little understood. To that end, what is the main moral principle in verses 275 to 281 that we can use to navigate new financial practices and instruments? And I guess as an aside, I would share this email that we got also, that one of your students had asked, or had alerted us to the Indonesian Ulama Council issuing a fatwa on the prohibition of cryptocurrency, and that the argument of the council is very simple. It's based on gharar and mesir, uncertainty and gambling, and was wondering what your opinion was on cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the such and the like. So.
Okay, so the first part of the question about
Obsession with profits being
yeah.
satanic and shaitan promising profits.
You know, a lot of people actually they don't know that in the history of the common law and in the history of Jewish law, these two, there have been a very rich discussion on precisely what usury is and the prohibition against usury. And if I would sum it up in both, it is an increase in money that is exploitative, that basically takes advantage of the needs of others to further their position of disempowerment. Now, what happened with modern financial institutions is that in the common law system and as well in the civil law system, the prohibition against usury, like the concept of pornography, like the concept in American law of legal entrapment, became basically meaningless. Although the Constitution prohibits entrapment, but the way the entrapment law have been interpreted, it has become entirely meaningless. Same thing with pornography. You know, till now, being obscene, the law prohibits obscenity, but the vast majority of what is pornographic material is not deemed obscene. And till now, technically speaking, if you wanted to go to the common law tradition or the non-statutory law, exacting usurious interest rates is not allowed. The problem is that the statutes and regulations basically have allowed institutions to set interest rates that sometimes are extremely high. When I go back to the historical dynamic, now of course, the Muslim jurists developed this whole thing about riba al-fadl, riba al-nasi'a, and that's a whole, and we could have a very interesting discussion focused on legal history and the history of the discourses on riba al-fadl and riba al-nasi'a. And Muslim jurists, generally speaking, were animated by two considerations. Some of them were animated by a very literal understanding of the tradition that you can't trade something for something of the same nature for an increase. And so they obsess about, well, is this equal to this? Is this the same thing as this? So I can't give you $10, and in return you give me $11. But the two main considerations that animated Muslim jurists, other than the sort of very literal understanding of two things of the same nature, is profits for no without labor, and increase on or financial increases that represent exploitation of the needs of others. So Muslim jurists were definitely suspect of the idea of profits without labor. And that is why some of them in the classical tradition even prohibited rentals. That, you're renting the house. Well, what labor, the reason what labor goes into that. And it took a long evolutionary process until the Hanafis eventually accepted rentals and said, well, financial institutions have to force us to allow to accept the idea that you can't always expect profit with labor, or you can't tie the two together without it becoming a serious financial obstacle. The part that became is they struggled with this element of exploitation. How do we define exploitation when we are talking about financial transactions that could take place any place in the Muslim world, whether in Egypt or in Medina or in Mecca or in Damascus or in Baghdad, and with imperfect information about who are coming to these financial transactions. So the way that then they try to approach it is to set rules for increase that would represent the increase in debts. I think if what the Quran, you go back to the Qur'anic, what the Quran was responding to, and what the Quran was responding to was exploitative institutions that not just took advantage of people's need, but that embedded people in their position of economic disadvantage. That if you are economically disadvantaged, you will remain economically disadvantaged. Now, if you put aside the technicalities of law, and again, I think it is important that we put aside the technicalities of law, and we go back to Quranic morality. What was the Quran trying to achieve morally? Not the mechanics of law. The Quran was clearly, whether when it talks about, you ought to lend people money and just be patient with them. You ought to lend people money and forgive it. You have to take care of the orphans and the poor and the wayfarer and so on. Or it talks about that, if you can't insult the dignity of people or degrade people, and if you go to degrade people, then it's better not to, then keep your money to yourself. What the Quran was consistently doing, morally speaking, is that to uplift people's dignity and their social mobility, their ability to come out of a position of a disadvantaged human being. Now, why am I emphasizing this? Because from that perspective, any financial arrangement that keeps the poor stuck to their poverty is immoral from a Qur'anic perspective, regardless of, the technicalities. So we make these financial Islamic banking arrangements. I mean, I've worked on several cases where I've testified as an expert witness in Islamic banking cases. And, we structure it where you buy the home, and I buy the home, and then, I'm effectively buying the home back from you. But ultimately, I end up, in the couple of cases that I've worked on, and actually there were more than a couple, but anyway, effectively I end up buying the home back or for far more than you've bought it, and I am bearing a much higher risk than if I would have gotten a regular mortgage. How is that consistent with the morality of the prohibition? Forget the technicalities of it. Without question, much of the interest rate that is charged by credit cards is usurious, because once you are in debt, you will remain in debt, and it is a whole structure of the system is structured to keep you in that cycle. From an Islamic perspective, it is immoral, but so is any other institution that keeps, what in Arabic parlance they say, the basha a basha. What keeps the master a master, and the master is always dealing from a position of benevolence, choice benevolence towards the dependent. If we would get beyond the mechanics of the law to the moral message of the Quran, I think we would start seeing things far more clearly. So, listen. Among the things that in the modern work environment, in so many institutions in the West, I'm not saying that the West has solved the problem of sexual harassment by far, and not even close, but what I'm saying is that there are situations that I've witnessed in Egypt and in some other Arab countries where the employee is so disempowered that there is no way to really redress sexual exploitation by the employer. I've had a student once from Iran came to me, told me a story about what happened to her by her employer, who forced her to do horrible things, because if she had no recourse, and if she would have left the job, it would have had horrible consequences for her children. So she was forced into a very degrading situation. I've seen that in Egypt, I've seen that in other Muslim countries, and when I compare this to the relative empowerment of employees in the West who know their rights, who know that they can go to an attorney and can, sue their attorney and etc., sue their employer. And believe me, I look at this as hardcore, as in its very core, as relevant to what the Quran says about riba. Far more than the technical issue of interest rate and because it is talking about who's exploiting who. And it, as a Muslim, it of course, the fact that it just shows how far we've drifted from the morality of the Quran. The Quran is saying, don't leave people in a disempowered position across the board. Don't put people at the mercy of other people. That's what it's all about. Because there are very nice people, but there are also very evil people. And if evil people can hurt those that depend on them without recourse, and it is not enough to say, well, oh, they could go to the police. Yeah, but what if you suffer from racial and class and gender divisions that makes going to the police entirely ineffective? That is not consistent with the morality of the Quran. And the sooner we get our children to understand that the Quran was about a moral project, not a legal project, to teach our children to be offended by injustice the way that the Quran was offended by injustice, I think maybe Allah's disappointment with us, maybe it will start being lifted. Maybe Allah will, I've often wondered, why do other societies just so happen to get, the U.S., if the U.S. didn't have George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as, among their first president, the entire U.S. experiment would have gone to hell. There were a lot of authoritarians, but there were enough level-headed people. Look at Israel. This I can't, and the founding fathers of Israel, and of course women as well. Why did they get people who were, for their purposes, on the right moral trajectory, for their purposes, with everything they've done to others, while we get, the likes of leaders that we get in the Muslim world? Can you imagine if the United States would have had Abdul Nasser as its founding father, or Sadat, or Mubarak? I can assure you, nothing would have become of the United States. People make a difference. The right person, the right historical moment makes a difference. And this is the part where I just, it just can't be a simple coincidence. It can't be. Moshe Dayan grew up in the house right in front of Abdul Nasser. They lived across the street from each other in Egypt. Moshe Dayan grew up in Egypt. And what Moshe Dayan did for Israel, and his morality vis-a-vis his people, as opposed to Abdul Nasser's morality vis-a-vis his people, Moshe Dayan's Jewishness, as opposed to Abdul Nasser's absolute lack of Islamic anything. It just, I don't know. You have to reflect on these things. You can't just let them pass.
Okay, so we're getting close to 9:30. We still have a lot of really good questions.
Let's go for a bit. Haram. I mean, the people here took up all the time.
Or we could consider extending to another session if we want.
No.
No?
You want to do another Surah Al-Baqarah session?
I don't. No. No. Are We have a lot of questions. Okay.
Okay,
So
well,
what
if you want next Saturday to be another quick Q&A, it's okay.
When we can discuss it offline, so maybe
Okay.
we can see also how many more we can get through.
If the people here want another Q&A session, I'm fine with it. Or if you
Well,
guys
let's-
think
why,
it's
why don't we talk about it
Yeah,
offline
you guys
and see,
will.
and we can
You
see
guys
what-
decide and
what
just let me know.
questions we have. Okay. So why don't I read? Okay, this one maybe is one you can answer quickly, and then we'll see if we have time for some guidance. Okay, no. We're going to do it this way. I'm going to read you 3 questions. You decide which one you want to answer. They're all a little bit different. Okay. 1. I appreciated your emphasis on the moral insignificance of history as a dominant theme in Baqarah. The transcendental status of morality is what appealed to me most about Islam. Could you please comment on the concept of al-maruf in the context of the moral insignificance of history? This is something that has always puzzled me. Okay, and then this next one. Is there a logic to the order of legal rulings addressed in the surah? Or is it based on the chronological order for which these issues arose? And is there a reason that Surah Baqarah comes second in the Quran after the Fatiha? And then this third question takes us into a different sphere, which is kind of interesting. What is it about Surah Baqarah specifically that makes it hard for magicians to defeat? They rip out this surah when desecrating the Quran to perform evil rituals. And why do al-Raqis refer to hadith that instruct for recitation of Baqarah daily to make evil flee from the home and break seer, or black magic, that can't be found? Are these narrations authentic? What is your opinion on sheikhs that say, well, you've recited Baqarah and said Bismillah when closing the door, so no evil is in your house? Case closed.
Wow, they're all good.
That's what I'm saying. We have a lot of really good questions. So,
Yeah.
or if you want to
Okay.
do all 3 and call it a night.
Okay, so I can't resist the temptation to address the third one. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so there's a let's see if I actually had noted. Sometimes I had copied these quotes from texts, but I never know if not, then I'll just have to paraphrase it. Yeah, so I okay. Okay, so we first about I'll take it from sort of a strange start. Black magicians and why they Surah Al-Baqarah actually we know that around verse 102, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about Sulaiman alayhi salam and the issue of magic. Now there is a long history to that. A lot of black magic is anchored on the mythology that even the symbols that are written that are supposed to what is the word I'm looking for when you call
Summon.
that's what is it?
Summon.
Yeah, that are supposed to summon demonic entities. They have a pre-Islamic history. Now, how far this history goes, how deep into pre-Islamic history it is, whether in fact it goes all the way back to the time of the Prophet Sulaiman or not, Allahu Alam. But the belief is that a lot of these symbols originated from the language that Sulaiman alayhi salam mastered, that which he used to communicate with the jinn. This and these symbols, as I said, they're remarkably old. Allahu Alam, especially in the black magic that emerges from the Near East part of the world. Now, in Islam, we don't believe that, as I said, that there are various reports about whether this was a text hidden under the throne of Sulaiman alayhi salam, whether this was, go back to the part of the tafsir where I talked about, I think it's verse 102, and so the way that developed in is that because Surah Al-Baqarah is the surah that specifically addresses what is often in black marriage known as the Solomonic key, the key to be able to summon demonic entities. So, and the fact that in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah puts the power with God, not with demons. And Allah describes Kayd al-Shaytan, the powers of the demonic, as weak. That is specifically why the practice of defacing Surah Al-Baqarah emerged. That you start out by denouncing the principle of divine supremacy over your magic, or over your ta'wizat, your what do you call ta'wizat?
Like seals? Like the charting they do?
The signs, the sort of the signs and symbols that you're writing that are then to call upon the powers of the demonic. So you start with desecrating that, and so in books of black magic that that even were written before Kabrit al-Ahmar and so on, you actually didn't desecrate the entire Surah Al-Baqarah, but you would desecrate the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah up to verse 102 and the end of Surah Al-Baqarah. And the end of Surah Al-Baqarah, because of Ayat al-Kursi, which was believed to have or have powers of compelling demons, or scaring or limiting or controlling demons. So now, so that's why the black magicians, so they, in at least in the old tradition, they would actually, what mattered is that because getting a copy of Surah Al-Baqarah was, you had to, buying the Quran was expensive, a written copy of the Quran was expensive, and often Quran was sold in parchment, so you just bought parchments of the Quran, not the entire Quran. So they would buy these parchments, these parts of the Quran, and they would desecrate that, and that was supposed to As to the reciting Surah Al-Baqarah, I don't think any of the traditions about reciting Surah Al-Baqarah as having especially compulsory powers over demons are of high reliability. And I know this will disappoint a lot of people who, read Surah Al-Baqarah with great confidence that all is solved. In my humble view, and Allahu Alam, is that Surah Al-Baqarah is as powerful as the rest of the Quran. I don't deny that there are parts, especially the parts that are chosen in ruqyas, that specifically remind or that evoke Allah's powers over the demonic, and that these are the most relevant parts. But just the idea that Surah Al-Baqarah itself, none of the traditions are sufficiently reliable that we can say that this is, but there is no, and I wonder, I mean, I have nothing to base this on other than just I'm wondering. I wonder whether the way that this emerged had something to do with the near immediate hostility of occult practitioners to what the Quran said about Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam, and that, and especially وَمَا كَفَرَ سُلَيْمَانَ وَلَكِنَّ الشَّيَاطِينَ كَفَرُوا, that it is remarkable, but it's a very big part of occult lore was the idea reaffirmed by the Bible that Sulaiman had lost his way and has succumbed to demonic influences. And that was, by occult practitioners, and the Quran comes and pours like cold water over this and says, nope, not true. Sulaiman was not just a king, and he all the things that the Bible accuses him of are not true, and he never succumbed to demonic powers. And from the earliest evidence we have, occult practitioners absolutely just hated that, just thought and mocked it, and it became very quickly part of what they incorporated in their defacement of the Quran. And so I wonder whether what the hadith that emerged was in response to that. I much prefer, if someone has an issue like that, when you're a young academic worrying about your career, you didn't talk about things like that. It's a sign that now you're old and you no longer care. When you just talk about it and you just don't care who says what. If you have a problem with something like that, I would get a good text of a ruqya. And that's what I would focus on, rather than just entire Surah Al-Baqarah. Okay, so what were the...
Okay, so, sorry, we have to backtrack a little bit because we skipped the second part of the financial question, which had to do with cryptocurrency.
The
yeah.
cryptocurrency. Oh, I completely forgot about it.
So just, again, just...
Okay.
Do you want me to...
Okay, no, I remember it. So, okay. So, let me just... In Indonesia, there was this whole discussion about cryptocurrency. And then a fatwa, a very well-known fatwa, was issued by a group of ulama that prohibited cryptocurrency. And the fatwa itself doesn't say much other than that it is gharar. And gharar means speculation. Initially, the response to the stock market, there's a famous Azhari fatwa that I don't remember whether it was 1930s or 1940s that said that the stock market is haram because of gharar. And then eventually it was dropped. And I don't claim that I really understand the world of cryptocurrency that well, but so it requires but from what I understand, it would seem to me that so much of modern currency, which doesn't, obviously we all know, doesn't rely on a gold standard, and it really, so much of modern currency, it privileges the currency backed up by former colonial powers, particularly the dollar and the euro. For a short while, it was the yen was also part of it, but because of but I don't think the yen is now. And when we say this, it's not just that a government says, I am supporting the value of this currency. In other words, a government is saying, I promise that that I am absolutely sort of the ultimate fallback for the value of this currency. But a lot of people ignore the fact that to our modern day age, a lot of all the derivative currencies, all the currencies that you find in different countries of the world, ultimately rely on the power of the dollar as a dominant currency in the world. And so our modern currency system clearly privileges a particular superpower and former colonial powers in Europe. A lot of things, if you want to export or import anything, you have to do it in hard currency. You can't do it in your local currency. So in many ways, local currencies are sort of good fictions for local populations. But if you get beyond your local populations and go to the world market, it is hard currency, meaning the currency of superpowers that actually matters, not your little local currency. Now, why do I say this? Because currency itself, it is based on a number of fictions, and B, we cannot ignore the fact that they privilege centers of power. And that is why, if you notice, the United States goes at great length to very aggressively combat any country that says, I will start doing business in other than the dollar. And this is, again, just part of the world we live in. Now, the stock market itself, although there is an underlying company that is supposed to be the basis of the stocks that you sell and buy, there have been a lot of studies about to what extent the underlying company actually really matters, rather than a whole bunch of complicated systems of fictions that create the price of these stocks. And so if it is the idea of gharar, then that's invalid. Because the same gharar exists in stocks, the same gharar exists in currency, that exists in cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency has had a potential of democratizing, taking some of the power out of traditional monopolistic centers of economic power. Unfortunately, although cryptocurrency seems to be something that can be created democratically anywhere in the world, again, most of where cryptocurrency companies have popped up have been the West, particularly the United States. I would just strongly urge Muslims, instead of focusing on saying it's haram, think of ways that perhaps you can co-opt the practice to empower Muslims. If cryptocurrency is what, then why can't Muslims back up their own cryptocurrencies? So, instead of all of us live, whether we like it or not, all of us live at the mercy of the dollar, and to a much lesser extent, the euro. The American stock market, and if just a few handful stock markets in the world, controls the rest of the economic pulse of the world. Cryptocurrency is coming in and complicated this picture. You can't produce a fiqhi response without taking that into account. I'm not saying I'm just saying take it into account. Be sophisticated. When you analyze something, analyze it from all its sophisticated aspects. Just saying it's gharar, well, then there's so much gharar that surrounds our lives and everything. And everything. If you want to really launch a revolution against gharar, then you're going to have to become far more. You're going to have to be far stronger in the world economy to actually be able to reshape the world on a non-gharar principle. But the world we live in is Muslims are on the tail end of things. I mean, all their economic wealth, it is even in all the wealth of the countries that most Muslims belong to. Their wealth is invested in the West. Living, breathing, eating gharar all the time. Including Indonesia's economy and Malaysia's economy. So it just seems to be, again, typically just, even if I say a typically Muslim response, immediately everyone knows that what I'm saying is that it's a typically simplistic, naive response. Why do we have to be like that? Why can't we get to the point where we say, it's a Muslim response. It means it's a sophisticated, complicated, really smart response. Why? I don't know. Okay, well, I forgot what else.
Inshallah.
What?
Okay, you have 8 minutes to answer the following two.
What was the other two questions?
All right, first one was, I appreciated your emphasis on the moral insignificance of history as a dominant theme in Baqarah. The transcendental status of morality is what appealed to me most about Islam. Could you please comment on the concept of al-maruf in the context of the moral insignificance of history? This is something that has always puzzled me. And then, is there a logic to the order of legal rulings addressed in the surah, or is it based on the chronological order for which these issues arose? Is there a reason that Baqarah comes second in the Quran after Fatiha?
Okay, I have 8 minutes, so I'll have to take the second question because the first question, I don't know if we can do it in 8 minutes. I tend to ramble. As far as I know, and Allahu Alam, there if there is a logic to the legal rulings in Surah Al-Baqarah, I have not discovered it. Now, with the Quran, you're constantly discovering new things. So, Allahu Alam, and someone else or I or might later on. As far as I know, it was the chronology of issues. Having said that, though, I do think that, remember I talked about the anecdotal, that the power, the law as anecdotes, that legal treatment is often an anecdote as to a moral lesson. It teaches you something about value. And what Allah chose to talk about, or the legal issues that Allah chose to address in the first revelation in Medina, in Surah Al-Baqarah, or the first prolonged revelation, to me does have great significance in understanding or in evaluating and analyzing the emphasis on what norms take priority and are, if you will, a hierarchy of norms. It is extremely noteworthy that the Quran addresses regulating something core to society like marriage and divorce on the one end, and the structure or the authenticating of financial transactions, that it chose to address the exploitative institution of usury, that it chose to address various issues related to the giving of money and giving to aid to those who are needy. So that definitely enters into analyzing the what are primary moral foundations, what are secondary moral foundations, and it is a part of a more holistic and a more regular analysis of the morality of the Quran. But why divorce was addressed at this point in Surah Al-Baqarah, and then later on usury is addressed, other than the historical chronology, I don't know. Now, as to why Surah Al-Baqarah is first, there are two responses that are usually, in terms of the way the Quran is organized, there are two responses that are usually given. That Al-Fatiha is an exception because it is it is said to be the heart and soul of the Quran. The entire Quran is summed up in Al-Fatiha. But other than that, the Quran was organized more or less by the size of the surahs, and that because Al-Baqarah was the longest, it was placed first. And you find that especially in the older sources, in terms of Kutub Jam' al-Quran, or the Masahif. There are books called the Masahif. The Masahif are basically texts written about the collection of the Quran the writing of the Quran and the organization of the Quran. Then in later centuries, texts written after the 3rd or 4th century Hijrah, what you start reading is that the Baqarah was placed first because in Surah Al-Baqarah is the most comprehensive commentary about all affairs that parallel what happens in real life. That in Surah Al-Baqarah is whether addressed directly or addressed by example, is the most comprehensive. So what, from just saying, well, in the first centuries, just saying, well, it's basically an organizing principle that you put the longest first, to those saying that no, there is a theological reason that Surah Al-Baqarah is put first, and that Surah Al-Baqarah is in fact the most comprehensive and hence also the most the nucleus of the Quran, that it is the sort of the core of the Quran. Some even argued that Surah Al-Baqarah, I remember, and I don't remember, I probably could find out which text, if I go back and look at my notes and stuff. But it said that Surah Al-Baqarah is like the heart of an onion, where all the other shells grow out, like how the onion is layered. And that Surah Al-Baqarah is basically the core, and then all the other surah are like layers upon Surah Al-Baqarah. And I can see that. It is in many ways. If the balance of the Quran is sort of, it's all been touched upon in Surah Al-Baqarah as a core. But whether that was the organizing principle as to why Surah Al-Baqarah was placed first, I don't know. It's a valid theological insight, especially as the idea gained currency that the way the Quran is organized is decreed by God. In the early book on Masahif and Kutub Jama' Quran, you will find a lot of discussion and a lot of disagreement as to whether it was divinely ordained and revealed that the Quran be organized the way it's organized, for the surahs in the order that they're in. In the later centuries, the idea that the current organization of the Mus'haf, the way it's organized, is actually ordained by God, gains far greater ground. The historian in me is skeptical that the organization of the Quran was divinely ordained, because just of all the reports that challenge that. But I would not be in favor of any effort that tries to publish the Quran in a different organization, because history has a weight and communities of interpretation have a weight, and you better come up with very good reason why to break rank with something that generation upon generation upon generation have done. You know, it doesn't mean, it means that the presumption is against you, and you have to bear the weight of evidence for as to why you would organize the Quran, if you, or come up with someone, you know, some people have suggested publishing the Quran, surahs organized by order of revelation, and as long as that doesn't become the standard of the Quran, so in other words, you're intentionally publishing it with all the explanations as to the debates about the order of revelation, because we don't want to give the impression to people that we are absolutely know when every surah was revealed in order of revelation, because as we've shown in many examples, we're not sure what the order of revelation was, and I don't think I think these debates, you know, are very deeply embedded in Islamic history. Anyway.
Okay, alhamdulillah, does it feel like 3.5+ hours have passed? I think, no, I know, so engaging.
God, it's been that long.
Yeah, it's 10 o'clock, after 10 o'clock.
You know, the amazing thing is that when I teach, like, if I have a 2-hour seminar in law, I feel completely destroyed after a 2-hour seminar. It's very different with this, when it's halaqas. Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. Well, it's been like that every halaqah, actually. I feel like it flies by. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Thank you, Sheikh, for incredible, enlightening answers. You know, we have the remaining questions, but we also have questions that we've been collecting along the way. So I think there is also an argument for us just to collect the pool of questions over the halaqas, you know, and there will be a time when we address a lot of these things and have an opportunity to go back to. And so I think it's important for us to consider that we're on a pace right now. We've got a mission. We got to finish all the surahs. So we'll talk offline about what makes sense, but I don't know if we'll do another Q&A. But we do know that we will be back on Saturday, inshallah. So I hope that you guys will join us. Thank you for being with us.
Can I just say that I feel really I feel particularly touched and privileged that we have so many visitors from that came to today's halaqah. I'm like just humbled and really deeply touched by all the people that came.
Our extended family, alhamdulillah.
Yeah.
And we're hoping, I mean, you know, our dream one day is hopefully that things will settle down with the pandemic and we can, you know, invite more people, you know, to come be with us, because, you know, we really treasure this community, and, you know, there are people who follow us from afar, even if they're not with us on live stream, but, you know, we hear from so many people who are with us, and people who love this deserve to know one another, because these are special people who believe in knowledge and believe in the power of this approach. So thank you, everybody. I hope that you will join us in celebrating the very appropriate Surah Baqarah conclusion tomorrow as an alternative to Thanksgiving, or Thanksgiving for the end of Surah Baqarah. And, you know, I'm really excited for what remains, which is still, oh my gosh, now we've finished 68. So we have 46 to go. Is that right? Inshallah, amazing. So thank you for being with us. Have a wonderful, hopefully, holiday, and we will see you on Saturday, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.